Hello and welcome to the Indiana State Police Roadshow. I'm your host, Sergeant John Perrine, the Public Information Officer for the Indiana State Police Indianapolis District. The Roadshow is brought to you each and every week by the Indiana State Police Alliance and Cops for Kids, a subsidiary of the State Police Alliance. For more information, visit www.indianasfinest.com. I want to thank Network Indiana and Eddie Griffin for getting us on the radio across the great state of Indiana each and every week. We certainly appreciate all they do to help us spread our safety messages. The man behind the camera, Tom Trial, making us look way better on YouTube than we actually do in person, especially for my guest today. That is my good friend and friend of the show, might as well be the co-host, my good buddy Mike Pruitt, Deputy Chief from Bargersville Fire Department.
We've been pitching co-hosts these ideas to all the media agencies for a long time. Maybe we're just not pretty enough.
One of these days, somebody's going to listen to our show and say, I've got to have those guys.
Yeah, right? Or we had the opportunity and we missed out.
You're right. That's probably the case. Anyway, here we are. And you're a busy man. I mean, I have no idea how you find the time to do what you do. Deputy Chief, Bargersville Fire Department, elected coroner in the Johnson County, Indiana, member of Indiana Task Force 1. And of course, you know, I ask you to do a million things and you're always doing those. So I don't know how you have to find any time.
I don't know any other life. Now, my wife does. She'll claim there is another life and we should go chase that. But I get a little grumpy when I'm not busy. So she lets me kind of do what I want.
Well, I think you're always busy, so it means you're always happy.
Well, yeah, take that with a grain of salt.
So, you know, one thing that I find pretty fascinating, and I always keep in touch with you and talk with you afterwards, is your deployment to Hurricane Ian in Florida as a member of the Indiana Task Force 1. And you went early. You actually sat through the hurricane in Central Florida. But I remember you also telling me probably the worst hurricane destruction that you've seen of all the hurricanes you've been deployed on.
Yeah, it was. And, you know, the square mileage of damage was just unbelievable. And I've been to a couple other hurricanes where there was a concentrated area of damage like this, but nothing to this magnitude.
So let's go back to the beginning and tell folks what it's like to be in that standby mode. You guys, everybody's watching the radars, just kind of until the last minute. They really don't know the exact path of these hurricanes. You know, you see these models with all these spaghetti lines, but you guys are deployed a few days beforehand. You get down there, you get set up, and you're waiting it out in a hotel. What's that like?
Right. FEMA pre-stages all the team. You know, we have 28 teams across the country, so FEMA makes the proper adjustments to move certain teams into the area, not necessarily to put us in the path of the storm, but put us on the kind of the outer boundaries of it. And then if the locals request the assistance through the state, through the feds, then they activate us, which typically happens in any major event. And so once the storm passed through, then we were immediately engaged in operations all the way from the East Coast to the West Coast of Florida. So, you know, it wasn't just a hurricane, even though that was the primary area where it hit and did the most damage. The state of Florida suffered damage from flooding and wind all the way across, all the way up to Tallahassee. So large event, takes a huge response. But as we watch those storms roll in, especially when we're watching the radar, watching the news, been doing this long enough that I know what's going on in the path of that storm, and it makes you feel terrible that you know there are people in there, you know there are people that didn't evacuate and what they're going through. And then when you hear the stories after the fact, when you meet up with those people finally, people that did not think the storm was going to be that bad or thought they could ride it out, and basically saying they'll never, ever do that again. So you get to hear all the stories after the fact, but it's pretty intense. I mean, everybody is ready to go to work. We travel hundreds of miles to get there with all of our equipment and our training. We're ready to go to work. So the moment the trigger's pulled on us and the other teams, we are a big machine that takes a little while to get us in motion, but once we're in motion, we do a lot of good work.
Yeah, and Indiana Task Force 1 is made up of a lot of different people. I think for the most part, it's first responders, firefighters, maybe some police officers, volunteers, right? I mean, they volunteer to be on the team, essentially.
Yeah, we had a few years ago, we started feeling sorry for police officers and they want to be involved. No, just kidding.
Yeah,
but, no, we have law enforcement contingent. Now, they're not necessarily there to do law enforcement activities. Right. They do planning, they do logistics. So some talented individuals who come in and are involved with firefighters. We have civilians, which includes doctors, canine handlers. So we are a very diverse group of talents. And it takes that to go into an incident and complete what we have to complete.
And what types of work are you in? And let's talk about next day, right? Hurricane comes through. You guys finally get to the area where you're going to offer that help. What type of work is priority, and how do you work through that?
So obviously life is the priority. So making sure that everyone is evacuated or rescued that needs to be taken care of. Then once we go through that rescue period, then it's there's kind of three levels of the disaster here. So there's the initial storm, and those people typically get rescued by the locals. And then there is the second part of the emergency, which is all the people that stayed behind. And that's typically where we really get involved a lot of times. So people that stay behind who need evacuated, need assistance, that's where we usually get a lot of our work, unless we just happen to be right in the middle of the storm when it comes in. Then the third phase of the disaster, which is almost a disaster in itself, is when everybody returns. People start getting injured. People need assistance when they get back. They realize, hey, I can't be here. So there's like 3 different levels of a natural disaster like this that we get put into the middle of. So everything from doing search and rescue to doing humanitarian work. I mean, just giving people food and water if they need it. So we do a little bit of everything. We're kind of a jack of all trades when it comes to a natural disaster, because trust me, there are things that we learn a lot of things on deployments during a disaster that we didn't think of. And we find something new every time, some new challenge that, we didn't think of, who knew the gators were going to be, the alligators were going to be upset down here when we got here. It's just little things we don't think of in Indiana, alligators.
Right.
We worry about maybe a dog biting you here. Down there, you got to watch your step where it's a snake or an alligator, because they're all angry because they just got a hurricane.
Right. So. You told me an interesting story about a man on a boat that was trying to get out of the harbor, and then you guys found him a couple days later, kind of in the middle of the town. So tell that story.
Yeah. So our first day into the Fort Myers Beach area, we were literally driving down the street, and there's this massive boat sitting right in the middle of the roadway. And there were a lot of boats. I mean, boats were everywhere. We don't necessarily know where any of them came from, but this one was very large, and there was a man and his dog sitting on the boat. And in speaking with this man about what his experience has been, he tried to get his boat out of the harbor when the storm was coming in. He couldn't do it. So basically, he took the boat and just started steering it back towards the harbor, which then ended up into the streets, between houses, to a point where his boat became lodged in the street, and that's where they rode out the storm. But he literally thought that they were going to die right there in the middle of that storm. But yeah, this boat just sitting in the middle of the street, probably every bit of 50 to 60 foot. And he was probably about another 50 foot in the air. And they were just sitting there, him and his dog, in the middle of the street. Wasn't anything they could do. It's not like you're going to call a tow truck in to get this boat out. But yeah, just story after story like that of people that we spoke with who lost neighbors who they knew stayed behind but were missing. The early projections were the numbers were through the roof on what they thought that they might be when it came to missing persons. Fortunately, those numbers, as it usually does in a storm like this, start decreasing. And people starting to be accounting for. But there were still a lot of people that stayed behind that lost their lives, and some of those may never be found. Let's just be honest, as the tide comes in and that flood surge comes in and goes out. So it's a very sad situation, but, I think people learned a few lessons.
And you guys were down there for about 2 weeks?
2 weeks, yep.
What were some of the... you don't want to put blame on anybody. What were some of the reasons why people told you that they didn't evacuate and wished they would have?
Well, there was a lot of talk about why some people didn't evacuate. When that storm came up into the Gulf, it was initially looking like it was going to head towards the Tampa area, which was farther north. And so I think a lot of people in that Fort Myers Beach area just kind of like said, oh, I think we're going to be okay. We're going to get some wind, obviously, maybe some flooding out of this. And then that storm made a hard right turn. And I mean hard right turn right into Fort Myers Beach and just hammered it. And so I think there were there was questions of whether there was evacuation orders given, and there were, but some people just didn't have anywhere to go. I mean, when you start evacuating an area like that with the number of people live there, where are you going to go? Sometimes, I mean, you could drive literally hundreds and hundreds of miles before you find a hotel or family even. to where you stay. So a lot of people decided to ride it out. What they weren't expecting was a 15-foot flood surge that came in and just literally moved houses. So if you took the front half of Fort Myers Beach and you folded it into the second half of Fort Myers Beach, that's kind of what happened. And then you got to include all the islands, Captiva, Sanibel, all those right there real close. It was just devastating destruction that, and it'll be years. So that's, people can't wrap their mind around. I had friends that were asking, hey, will we be able to go on vacation there next year? We have condos there, things like that we normally stay in. It's not going to happen. I mean, they're literally going to have to gut a lot of those high-rise condos just from water damage alone. But they've got a long rebuilding process. I still go to Mexico Beach that was hit by a Category 5 Michael, and I drive through there when I'm going across the Panhandle, and there's still like so many vacant lots and just a lot of area that has not recovered since that storm. So, it's going to be a while.
Yeah, and you hate to hear that because tourism is one of their big industries down there, and they need the tourism for their economy. So certainly a lot of rebuilding left to do, but just quite an experience that you had down there. It
is. The resources that come in to Florida, and Florida is a very resource-heavy state. So when they're asking for help, it's bad. Yeah. But whether it's local, state, federal, I mean, every federal agency you could imagine coming in down there to work, private contractors. I mean, the sand it was like snow here in Indiana. The sand was like 2-3 foot deep in the streets. So when they got payloaders, and because they don't have snowplows down there, so they got payloaders just cleaning out the streets so we can at least get through. So just things we don't think about. Yeah,
and one of the things that always tends to be difficult in a hurricane is communication. Not just for the emergency first responders, but for everybody. And we live in a world where we expect to be connected everywhere we are. So for some folks to go weeks without that connection or that service or that ability to communicate kind of adds some difficulties too.
Cell phone service in the evening was great because people left the area. But then when everybody was there working, cell service was terrible. We even had a lot of issues with transferring data that we were collecting. But, they brought in, it's just not there's just some interesting technology, Starlinks, things that we've seen being used overseas and some events going on that Elon Musk has brought into the system. They delivered those Starlink connections to us, the satellite connections, which improved our data to be able to share information on what was going on. So we saw things like that come into play that we had never used before that really helped our communication.
Yeah, and is there a chance, so Task Force 1 has been there and back. Would you guys be redeployed to the area, or now they're in a different mode?
No, usually we're just deployed during the rescue mode. FEMA has other assets that come in for recovery side of things. So we're typically there, 7 to 14 days to conduct our part of the business, and then we're demobilized and sent home.
And a neat thing about Task Force 1 is it seems like as long as I've known you, the vast majority of your deployments are to hurricanes because we're within a day's drive, obviously accessible to them. But you guys are also prepared for other emergencies. Flooding. You've been to other tornadoes, flooding, fires, things like that. So just real briefly, kind of talk about Task Force 1's other types of deployments that you could have.
So, we've done the tornado response to Kentucky. The team went to Florida to the Surfside collapse, responded down there. So we're trained in many different things. And then we adapt to many things that maybe we've never done before. But any natural disaster, man-made or natural, I mean, we think back to 9/11, the team went there to New York City on that response. So very talented group of people that train year-round and are always ready to deploy out the door. And so it's a great organization to be a part of. It's one that I'm going to stay with it as long as they will let me. I think max age is 70, so yes. I've got 13 more years. I can still be a part of Task Force 1.
Very cool, very cool. Well, Mike, I know I've known you a long time, and I certainly appreciate your friendship, but your dedication to public service is unmatched with what you do on your everyday as a coroner, as a deputy chief, and certainly you're volunteering to be away from your family and everything else for these long periods on Task Force 1. So we all appreciate your dedication for that.
Well, thank you, John. I appreciate it.
We want to thank everybody for tuning into the Indiana State Police Roadshow. We're sponsored by the Indiana State Police Alliance and Cops for Kids, which is a subsidiary of the State Police Alliance. You can visit www.indianasfinest.com for more information on our sponsor. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Buckle your seatbelts, and we will see you next time.